The Rent is Due by Jonas Gloric. The hole in my memory tasted like copper pennies and burnt silicon. I was standing in front of 32 community college students, marker raised halfway to the whiteboard, when the gap hit. 1 second I was explaining recursive functions. The next I was staring at code I didn't remember writing. My handwriting, but the logic was sideways, elegant in a way that made my teeth ache. "Professor Chen?" Maria's voice from the third row. "You okay?" I blinked hard, trying to sync my neural baseline with reality. The classroom snapped back into focus. Cracked linoleum floors, flickering LED panels that the college couldn't afford to fix, the smell of burnt coffee from the teacher's lounge mixing with that particular ode to broke student. Ramen, energy drinks, and desperation. Yeah, just... I set the marker down carefully, like it might explode. "Let's take a 5-minute break." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. The tenant share app icon pulsed in the corner of my screen. A cheerful brain with a dollar sign for a frontal lobe. I'd agreed to 6 hours of unconscious processing per night. That was it. Nothing during waking hours. Nothing that should leave me standing in front of my intro to programming class with a 10-minute hole in my consciousness. But the app showed everything normal. 6.0 hours allocated. 5.8 hours used last night. Current neural load, 0%. Bullshit. I ducked into the hallway, past the mural some art students had painted last year. Oakland, still here, in letters made of BART tickets and eviction notices. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like shit. Bloodshot eyes, that particular grey pallor you get from too many nights selling your REM cycles to make rent. The neural jack behind my left ear was warm to the touch. Not burning, not yet, but warmer than it should be at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Having problems, Professor?" I spun around. Deshawn from my advanced data structures class was washing his hands, but his eyes were on my reflection. "Just tired." The lie came automatically. You didn't advertise neural share problems. Not in Oakland, not anywhere. It was like admitting you couldn't hack it in the gig economy. "You know how it is?" Yeah. He dried his hands on his jeans. The paper towel dispenser had been empty since 2019. "My mom's been getting these headaches. She's on tenant share too. Says it feels like someone's rifling through her dreams with dirty fingers. She should check her settings." She did. His voice was flat. "Settings say 8 hours. But she's losing time during her shifts at the hospital. Almost gave a patient the wrong meds yesterday. She tried to get the jack removed last month. You know what they told her? The neural tissue has already bonded. Removal would cause permanent damage to her motor cortex. 60 grand for the surgery if she wanted to risk paralysis." The copper taste was back. "She needs to contact support." "You think she hasn't tried?" He laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "You know what they told her? Read her lease. Page 47, subsection 3C, neural lien clause." My stomach dropped. Neural lion? "Miss Rent, they can take up to 60% of conscious processing. Legal as a parking ticket." He shouldered his backpack. "But here's the thing. Mom hasn't missed rent. Not once in 2 years. Plus," he called back over his shoulder, "removal voids your lease. It's in the contract. Maintaining neural capability is a condition of residency. They've got doctors who'll testify that jack removal is voluntary disability. Try finding housing after that." He left me standing there, staring at my reflection. The neural jack pulsed with my heartbeat. Page 47, subsection 3C. I'd signed my lease renewal last month. 48 pages of legalese that I'd skimmed because what choice did I have? $3,200 for a studio apartment with a view of the freeway and black mold that management swore was just vintage character. Back in the classroom, my students were comparing phones. Half of them had tenant share icons. The other half had Brain Lease, Cortex Cache, or one of a dozen other neural monetization apps. All of them promising to solve the same problem. how to exist in a city where a coffee cost $9 and minimum wage was still $15. All right, let's talk about recursive functions. I picked up the marker again, ignored the tremor in my hand. Can anyone tell me what's happening in this code? The code on the board was beautiful. Each line clean, efficient, solving the Tower of Hanoi problem with an elegance I'd never achieved. My handwriting, but not my mind, or not entirely my mind. It's using memoization to optimize the recursive calls, said Kenji from the back. Stores solved sub-problems to avoid redundant calculations. Good. I hadn't known that. I mean, I knew it now, looking at it, but I hadn't known it when I'd written it. And why is that important? Saves processing power, Maria said. Makes it run faster. Right. And what happens if we're not careful with our recursive calls? I forced myself to stay present, to teach through the fog. What if we don't properly bound our inputs? Stack Overflow, Deshawn said quietly. The function keeps calling itself until it runs out of memory. Exactly. Buffer overflows too, if we're not careful with array bounds in our recursive solutions. I tapped the board. These are the kinds of vulnerabilities that can crash entire systems. Or ... quote. I paused, a thought tickling the edge of my stolen consciousness. Be exploited by someone who understands the architecture. Processing power. Everything came back to processing power. After class, I sat in my car. A 2019 Honda held together by duct tape and prayer. I read my lease. Page 47 was stuck to page 48 with what looked like coffee, but I peeled them apart carefully. Section 3C, Neural Lane and Cognitive Asset Management. The language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Miss rent and they could tap your conscious cycles. But buried in subsection 3C7 was something worse. In the event of suspected lease violations, management reserves the right to conduct preventive cognitive asset recovery to ensure payment continuity. Suspected violations? Like what? Looking at other apartments? Interviewing for a job in Sacramento? Thinking about breaking lease? My phone buzzed. Notification from TenantShare. Daily processing complete. You've earned $47.83 toward next month's rent. $47. For 6 hours of my dreams, my unconscious mind churning through datasets for some tech company that needed cheap neural cycles for their machine learning algorithms. At this rate, I'd need to process 67 nights just to make rent. That left me 5 days for utilities, food, gas, and the minimum payment on my student loans. I drove home through Oakland's eternal construction, past what used to be a black neighborhood before the tech money noticed the weather was nice. Every block told the same story. New glass towers rising from the bones of old Victorians. 4 lease signs in languages that shifted with the demographics. English, Spanish, Mandarin, Telugu, JavaScript. The neural sharing started in 2027, right after the second tech crash. Temporary measures, they called it. Innovation in housing affordability. Seattle banned it after 6 months of seizures and memory disorders. Portland lasted a year. But California saw tax revenue in every synapse and let the market self-regulate. My apartment building squatted on the edge of Fruitvale, close enough to BART that you could feel the trains in your teeth. The TenantShare receiver was built into the front door, a black box the size of a briefcase, bristling with antennas. When I badged in, I felt it ping my neural jack. Just a quick handshake, making sure I was still online, still profitable. Mrs. Okafor was in the lobby, slumped in one of the plastic chairs management had bought to replace the ones they'd thrown out. She was wearing her grocery store uniform, but her eyes were closed, neural jack glowing soft blue. Mrs. O? I touched her shoulder gently. Her eyes snapped open, pupils dilated. What time is it? 4:30. Shit. She struggled to her feet. I'm supposed to be at work. I sat down for a minute. How long have you been here? I don't. She touched her neural jack, winced. Maybe an hour? I was going to work, and then I was here. I helped her to the door, watched her hurry toward the bus stop. Another hole. Another gap. How many of us were losing pieces of ourselves minute by minute, bite by bite? My studio was exactly as I'd left it. 400 square feet of carefully managed desperation. Mattress on the floor because bed frames were for people without 6 figures of student debt. Desk made from a door I'd found on the street. Kitchen that was really just a hot plate and a mini fridge humming at a frequency that made my fillings ache. The framed photo of my parents sat next to my laptop, taken last year at their 40th anniversary. They lived in Stockton now, in a mobile home I helped pay for. Mom still thought I was saving money, still asked when I'd buy a place of my own. I hadn't told them about the neural sharing, hadn't told them their son was selling his mind by the hour to keep them housed. My phone rang. Mom's nightly check-in, regular as clockwork. Kevin, you sound tired. Just grading papers, Ma. Always working. When are you going to visit? Your father wants to show you the tomatoes he's growing. Soon, I lied, touching my burning neural jack. How could I explain that Cerberus might extend their reach to Stockton? That my resistance could cost them their home? We're proud of you, she said, like she always did. Our son, the professor. The words cut deeper than any neural extraction. After she hung up, I stared at their photo. They'd sacrificed everything to put me through school. Now, I was sacrificing pieces of my mind to keep them safe. The recursion of immigrant dreams, each generation consuming itself for the next. I opened my laptop, started digging into tenant shares documentation. The public stuff was all marketing speak. Transform your downtime into income. Your dreams can pay your rent. But the technical specs were harder to find. I'd been a teacher for 5 years, but before that, I'd worked in tech. Startups mostly, building systems I believed would change the world, until I realized they just wanted to change bank accounts. Teaching paid half what coding did, but at least when I went home, my conscience was my own. Or it used to be. 3 months ago, before the gaps started, I'd been working on an open source education platform in my spare time. Something to help kids like my students access quality programming courses for free. 6 months of work, gone. Not deleted, worse. Completed during my gaps and submitted to a repository owned by a neural net subsidiary. My code, my vision, but their property now. 3 hours later, I found it. Buried in a GitHub repository that someone had forgotten to make private. The real architecture of tenant share. My coding instincts, rusty but functional, started firing. I pulled the repository, began analyzing the codebase. It wasn't just passive processing. The system was designed to tap into active neural pathways, mining not just computational power, but pattern recognition, creative problem solving, even muscle memory. They weren't just using our sleeping brains as processors. They were using our waking minds as training data. My phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Chen? The voice was professionally cheerful. This is Alexis from Cerberus Property Management. I'm calling about your lease. What about it? We've noticed some unusual patterns in your neural contribution. Several incomplete processing cycles. We're concerned you might be attempting to manipulate the system. I haven't done anything. Of course not. But per Section 3(c)(7) of your lease, we'll need to increase your contribution temporarily, just to ensure compliance. How much? An additional 2 hours of conscious processing daily, just for the next month, to make up for the shortfall. There is no shortfall. I've made every payment. Mr. Chen, the lease is very clear. We appreciate your cooperation. She hung up before I could respond. My neural jack was already warming. 2 hours of conscious processing, on top of the 6 unconscious hours, 8 hours total. A third of my life, siphoned off to pay for the privilege of existing in a place that used to build its own future instead of strip mining it from its residents' minds. I called Deshaun. You were right about the neural lean. Yeah? He sounded tired. They get you too? 2 hours conscious, starting immediately. Mom's up to 4. They say she's been unconsciously resistant during her sleep cycles, whatever that means. There's got to be something we can do, some kind of tenant protection. You know what the waiting list is for this building? His laugh was bitter. 300 applications. You complain, you're gone. And good luck finding another place that'll take someone with an eviction on their record. He was right. The trap was perfect. Complain and lose your housing. Don't complain and lose your mind piece by piece, memory by memory. The first conscious processing hit at 6 p.m. I was heating ramen when my vision stuttered. One moment I was watching water boil. The next, I was sitting on my mattress, noodles cold in my lap. My laptop was open, showing code I didn't recognize. Something about optimizing delivery routes. The timestamp said 8:17 p.m. 2 hours. Gone. Just like that. I forced myself to eat the cold noodles, then started documenting everything. The code I'd written during the gap, the problems it solved, the elegant solutions my mind had produced while I wasn't in it. By midnight, I had enough evidence to see the pattern. They weren't just stealing processing power. They were stealing expertise. My 13 years of programming experience filtered through their algorithms, solving problems for companies that would have paid a consultant $300 an hour. The really sick part? The code was good. Better than good. It was the kind of work I did when I was in the zone, when everything clicked. Except I wasn't there for any of it. My neural jack burned constantly now. I tried to sleep, but the unconscious processing felt different, heavier, like someone was strip mining my dreams with industrial equipment. I woke at 3 a.m. to a notification. Payment processed. Your account has been credited $63.42. $63 for 8 hours of my mind. Less than minimum wage for thoughts that someone, somewhere, was reselling for thousands. I couldn't do this. None of us could do this. But what was the alternative? Live in my car? Join the encampments under the freeway? Leave Oakland? Leave California? Leave everything I'd built here? My phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Check your door. I crept to the door, peered through the peephole. A piece of paper was taped to the outside. I grabbed it quickly, locked the door behind me. It was a flyer, hand-drawn. Neural Tenants Union. Your mind is not their mine. Meeting Thursday, 7 p.m. St. Augustine's basement. St. Augustine's was 6 blocks away, one of the last churches that hadn't been converted to condos. I'd walked past it 100 times, never really seeing it, but someone there was seeing us. The next 2 days blurred together. Teaching through gaps, grading papers I didn't remember collecting, watching my students' faces for signs they were losing time too. Maria started bringing me coffee, wordlessly placing it on my desk when my hands shook too hard to write. Thursday arrived like a fever breaking. I marked the calendar 3 times to make sure I wouldn't forget. Set 17 alarms on my phone. Whatever they were mining from my mind, I was going to be at that meeting. St. Augustine's basement smelled like decades of potluck dinners and desperate prayers. About 30 people sat in a circle of mismatched chairs. I recognized half of them from my building, others from the neighborhood. Mrs. Okafor was there, still in her grocery uniform. Deshaun sat next to his mom, a woman with tired eyes and careful hands. "Welcome," said the woman running the meeting. She was maybe 60, grey locks wrapped in bright fabric, wearing a housing is a human right pin that had seen better decades. "I'm Patricia. Used to teach at Berkeley before they decided adjuncts didn't need health insurance. Now I organize." "Organize what?" asked someone from the back. "You can't organize against math. We need the money. They have the technology." "That's what they want you to think." Patricia smiled like a knife. "But let me ask you something. How many of you have read your entire lease?" A few hands went up. How many of you know that Cerberus Property Management is a subsidiary of Neural Net Solutions, which is owned by the same venture capital firm that funds TenantShare? Silence. "They're not just double-dipping," she continued. "They're creating vertically integrated poverty. Jack up the rent, offer a solution that makes you dependent, then mine you for everything you're worth. So what do we do? Mrs. Okafor's daughter asked. Stop paying rent? They'll evict us in a heartbeat. We document, we organize, and we fight back with the one thing they can't algorithm away: collective action. She explained the plan. Simple, but requiring courage none of us could afford. Document every gap, every stolen moment. File complaints with the city, the state, anyone who would listen. And if that didn't work, we disconnect. All of us. Same day, same time. They'll evict us, someone said. All of us? 30 units in one day? The headlines write themselves. Mass eviction of neural share tenants. The city council's already nervous about the optics of the homeless crisis. This could push them to act. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all we had left. I went home and kept documenting. The gaps were getting longer. 4 hours gone on Friday, 6 on Saturday. By Sunday, I was losing half my waking hours. My neural jack was hot enough to burn, but disconnecting would trigger the lease violation immediately. Monday morning, I stood in front of my class with a splitting headache and a plan. Today, we're going to talk about recursive functions, I said. But first, I want to show you something. I pulled up my documentation on the projector, the code I'd written during gaps, the timestamps, the proof that someone was stealing more than just processing cycles. This is what neural sharing really looks like, I said. This is what they're taking from us. The room was silent. Then Kenji raised his hand. My dad's been having gaps too. He's an architect. Keeps finding blueprints he doesn't remember drawing. My sister's a nurse, said another student. She's been writing care plans in her sleep. Detailed ones, for patients she's never met. One by one, they shared their stories. A web of exploitation, threading through families, communities, entire neighborhoods. All of us feeding the same machine, losing pieces of ourselves to pay for the right to exist. What do we do? Maria asked. I thought about Patricia's plan, about the risk of eviction, of losing everything. Then I thought about Mrs. Okafor, asleep in the lobby, about Deshawn's mom, almost poisoning a patient, about all the minds being strip-mined for profit. We organize, I said, and we fight back. That night, I coded until my eyes burned, building a simple app that would run in the background, logging every neural access, every timestamp, every gap. Nothing fancy, just evidence collection. I pushed it to GitHub with instructions simple enough for anyone to use. Called it MindLog. Within hours, Deshawn had forked it, added features. Maria translated the interface to Spanish. Kenji optimized the code. The resistance started small. Flyers in laundromats. Whispered conversations on BART, a Facebook group that grew from dozens to hundreds in a week. But the real explosion came when we released MindLog publicly. Suddenly, people could see their theft in real time, could watch their thoughts being siphoned, tagged, packaged, sold. The data was damning. Average conscious processing theft, 3.7 hours beyond contracted amounts. Peak theft times, during creative tasks, problem solving, emotional processing. They weren't just stealing our computing power, they were stealing our humanity. 3 weeks after releasing MindLog, I got the meeting I'd been dreading. Mr. Chen. The Cerberus representative didn't bother with pleasantries. Marcus Webb, according to his badge, VP of Tenant Relations. He'd commandeered the community centre where I taught evening classes, 2 security guards flanking the door. You've been busy. Teaching is my job. Creating software that interferes with lease-mandated services. He slid a tablet across the table. Legal documents. Cease and desist orders. That's cybercrime, Mr. Chen. Violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Documenting theft isn't a crime. Theft? His smile was practiced, predatory. You signed a contract. Every tenant in our properties did. Neural sharing is a voluntary service. Voluntary? I pulled up MindLog on my phone, Showed him my stats. I agreed to 6 hours unconscious. You're taking 22 hours total. That's theft. That's optimization. Your lease clearly states, my lease is 48 pages of deliberate obfuscation. You're counting on people being too exhausted, too desperate to read the fine print. He leaned back, studied me. You were quite good, you know. Tech sector, Series B startup, senior developer. Why throw it away for this? He gestured at the peeling paint, the water-stained ceiling. Because code should solve problems, not create them. Noble. Naive, but noble. He stood, collected his tablet. You have 48 hours to remove your software and cease all organizing activities. After that, he shrugged. Well, housing is scarce in the Bay Area. Would be a shame if you and your parents had to relocate. My blood went cold. My parents aren't even in your properties. No, but their landlord is quite interested in our neural sharing program. Efficiency is contagious, Mr. Chen. After he left, I sat in the empty room, hands shaking. They weren't just threatening me. They were threatening everyone I cared about. The system was bigger than Cerberus, bigger than tenant share. It was an ecosystem of extraction. But that's when I realized ecosystems could be hacked. That night, I discovered something else in the tenant share code. A logging function that recorded not just processing time, but content. Encrypted, but poorly. Every algorithm we'd unconsciously solved, every pattern we'd recognized, every creative leap our sleeping minds had made. All stored in their servers. Evidence of exactly what they'd stolen. I called Patricia. We need to accelerate the timeline. What happened? They threatened my parents. They know about MindLog. We have 48 hours before they start retaliating. Then we move in 24. The next 24 hours would become legend in the movement. I pushed updates to MindLog while Patricia transformed the church basement into a digital fortress. 30 tenants hunched over borrowed laptops, the air thick with burnt coffee and revolution. Remember, Patricia said, pacing between the folding tables, they own the infrastructure, but we own our minds. Kevin's going to teach you how to keep it that way. I stood before a projection of basic encryption protocols, my neural jack throbbing. Think of your data like your thoughts. Once they have it, you can't get it back. But we can make sure they can't read what they steal. Mrs. Okafor raised her hand. I can barely use email. How am I supposed to? You organized a phone tree for 300 families, I interrupted gently. This is simpler. One key to lock, one key to unlock. Like having 2 apartment keys. One for you, one hidden for emergencies. Deshaun was already 3 steps ahead, showing his mother how to generate keys on her phone. Maria translated my instructions into Spanish for the Hernandez family. Within 2 hours, we had 43 people running encrypted MindLog instances. Professor Chen! Kenji burst through the door, laptop clutched to his chest. We found something. He connected to the projector, showing code that made my stolen memories sing. Remember when you taught us about buffer overflows? We've been analyzing tenant shares architecture all night. We? I asked. The whole class. Maria appeared behind him, followed by 6 other students, all carrying laptops and the manic energy of discovery. We set up in the computer lab. Security didn't notice because, well, we're always there. Look at this. Deshaun pulled up a function, highlighting a specific section. They're using deprecated memory management. If someone knew the exact timing. We could force a segmentation fault, I finished, the possibility hitting like ice water. Crash their whole collection system. Not hack, Kenji said carefully. Just document the vulnerability, very thoroughly, in a public paper. The room went quiet. Then Patricia laughed, sharp and delighted. The master's tools might not dismantle the master's house, but apparently his code can dismantle itself. By dawn, we had 3 teams. Patricia's group handling media and legal protection, Mrs. Okafor coordinating safe houses and resources, and my students building what would become the technical knife in Cerberus's side. "Mom's here," Deshawn said quietly, as his mother arrived with a box of sandwiches. She said, "If we're going to fight, we're going to eat." I watched my students work, teaching each other, building on fragments of stolen knowledge to create something wholly their own. This was what education meant. Not just transferring information, but lighting fires that spread beyond any classroom. But Cerberus was moving too. The next morning, 6 families in our building received eviction notices. Lease violations, all dated weeks ago, all citing Clause 3C7. The message was clear: resist and be destroyed. Except they'd miscalculated. The evicted families didn't disappear. They moved into St. Augustine's, sleeping bags on pews, turning the church into a visible camp of neural refugees. The priest, Father Martinez, opened the doors wider. "Sanctuary," he said simply, "is sanctuary." Local news picked it up first. Families evicted for refusing neural sharing, then national. The mines they mine, inside the Bay Area's cognitive housing crisis. But the real explosion came later that day. "Portland," Patricia announced, holding up her phone. 1,500 tenants just disconnected. They're citing our documentation." "Chicago," someone else called. Neural Workers Union just formed. They're using MindLog. "Holy shit," Maria breathed, showing me her laptop. "We're trending in Seoul. They're translating our code into Korean." The movement had jumped containment. Every city where rents exceeded reality, where bodies became collateral for shelter, people were recognizing their own exploitation in our story. Number neural rent became number my mind is not your mine. Local struggles linked into something larger. Cerberus responded with lawyers and lobbyists, but we had something better: code and community that kept spreading. I worked 18-hour days, improving MindLog, creating visualization tools, building systems to help people understand their exploitation. My gaps grew worse. Sometimes I'd lose 3-4 hours at a stretch, but every stolen moment was documented, uploaded, shared. The breakthrough paper came at midnight. Security Vulnerabilities in Neural Sharing Protocols by Chen, Tanaka, Gonzalez, et al. My students had found what we needed: proof that tenant shares architecture was not just exploitative, but fundamentally broken. The tech press smelled blood in the water. Stock prices plummeted. Neural net solutions lost 40% of its value in a week. Suddenly, investors were nervous about the legal implications of consciousness theft, but victory was far from assured. The first setback came when they cut our internet. Every building running tenant share suddenly had network maintenance. We pivoted to mobile hotspots, but data was expensive and spotty. I spent nights coding offline solutions, apps that could sync when they found signal. The second setback was worse. They started selective evictions. Not leaders, but the most vulnerable. Single mothers, elderly tenants, people with medical conditions who needed stable housing. The calculation was cruel and effective. Make us choose between protecting everyone and protecting anyone. We failed sometimes. The Nguyen family, with their disabled daughter, took the amnesty deal after living in their car for a week. Mr. Johansson, 73 with diabetes, went back when he couldn't refrigerate his insulin in the camps. Each person who returned felt like a personal failure, but Patricia kept us focused. "This is how they win," she said during one particularly dark meeting. "They make us feel responsible for their cruelty. We're not failing these people. The system is." So we adapted. Set up medication refrigerators powered by solar panels. Created childcare collectives so parents could work without neural sharing. Built a whole shadow infrastructure for survival. My coding skills had never been more practical. Scheduling apps for resource sharing, encrypted communication channels, even a bartering system for exchanging services without money. The surveillance was constant. Drones over the camps. Private investigators following organizers. They tried to infiltrate our meetings with tenants who'd taken deals to spy. We developed protocols, verification systems, secure channels, trust networks built on shared struggle. But the real momentum came from the ground up. The camps grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands. Not just in Oakland, Hayward, Richmond, even tech workers in Palo Alto. My phone buzzed with a video from Seattle. Hundreds of tenants marching on the Space Needle, neural jacks covered with red tape. "Our thoughts are not your products," their signs read. The caption, "Oakland started it. Seattle's finishing it." Another notification, Berlin, London, São Paulo. The infection of consciousness spreading faster than any virus. Each city adding its own flavor of resistance. Berlin's hackers creating mesh networks, London's tenants occupying neural share corporate offices, São Paulo's favela organizing teaching community tech defense. "It's not just housing anymore," Patricia said, watching news feeds cascade across her tablet. "It's everyone who's been told their humanity is a resource to be optimized." Turned out when you made exploitation visible, people recognized their own chains. Week 3 brought a new challenge. Some tenants started experiencing withdrawal. Not psychological, physiological. Turns out regular neural sharing created dependencies. Headaches, tremors, cognitive fog. We had a neuroscience PhD student in the camps who explained it. Our brains had adapted to external processing, like muscles atrophying from disuse. I built rehabilitation exercises into an app. Cognitive calisthenics, we called it. Simple puzzles and memory games to help brains remember how to think alone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. We needed software to recover from software. I barely slept, coding defensive measures for the network. Patricia handled media. Mrs. Okafor managed logistics. Deshawn became our security expert, teaching people to recognize surveillance to protect themselves from retaliation. 3 nights before April 1st, I finally called my parents. "Kevin?" My father's voice surprised. "It's late." "I know, Ba. I need to tell you something." I explained everything. The neural sharing, the organizing, the risk to their housing if Cerberus retaliated. The silence stretched until I thought the call had dropped. "You're fighting them?" Mom's voice, on speaker now. "Yes." "Good," Dad said simply. "We didn't come to this country so you could rent out your mind." "But your home is just walls and a roof," Mom interrupted. "Your mind, Kevin. That's the house we built. That's what matters." "Mom, I can't teach my students to think for themselves while someone else is thinking with my brain." "Then teach them," she said. "And if they come for us, we'll handle it. We've survived worse than eviction." After we hung up, I sat in the dark, neural jack burning, and felt something I'd lost in the gaps. Clarity. Not everyone could afford to resist, but those of us who could had an obligation to those who couldn't. The morning of April first arrived like a fever dream. I hadn't slept in 36 hours, running on coffee and determination. My neural jack burned constantly, the system trying to extract every last bite before we disconnected. At 11:45, Marcus Webb called. "Last chance, Chen. Stand down now, and we'll forget this happened. You can keep your apartment, your job. We'll even reduce your neural sharing requirements." And everyone else. "Market forces will determine." I hung up. At Cerberus headquarters in San Francisco, Webb stared at his monitoring screens. Every neural share connection in the Bay Area pulsed on the map like a vast constellation of exploited consciousness. In 15 minutes, those lights would start going dark. "Sir," his assistant said nervously, "should we initiate emergency protocols?" Webb watched the connection statistics, the processing power they'd been siphoning, the millions in computation they were about to lose. "They'll be back," he said. "They always come back." But for every person they silenced, 10 more joined the movement. The Oakland Neural Tenants Union, the San Francisco Cognitive Workers Collective, even some tech workers in Mountain View, the ones living in their cars because not even 6-figure salaries could match the rent. We'd built redundancies into our network. If they took out leaders, others stepped up. If they blocked one communication channel, we opened 3 more. Every tenant who joined brought skills, legal knowledge, medical expertise, coding abilities. We weren't just resisting, we were building an alternative. The day came faster than expected. April 1st, because irony was all we had left. At exactly noon, over 3,000 Neural Share tenants across the Bay Area would disconnect. We'd arranged lawyers, documented everything, prepared for the backlash. The camps were ready to expand. Churches, community centres, even some small businesses had pledged space. I stood in my apartment at 11:55, hand on my neural jack. Around me, everything I owned fit in 2 boxes. When they evicted me, and they would, I'd be ready. My phone buzzed with messages from the network. Ready in Richmond, disconnecting in Daly City. Oakland standing by. 11:59. I thought about my students, about the code I'd written and forgotten, about the future we were building, one stolen thought at a time. Around me, I knew 3,000 others were doing the same thing. Hands on jacks, hearts hammering. The collective held breath of a city about to reclaim its mind. Noon. I pulled the jack. The relief was immediate, like taking off shoes that were 3 sizes too small, like breaking the surface after too long underwater. My thoughts were my own, scattered and imperfect, and entirely mine. Across the Bay Area, the disconnection rippled like a wave. In Hayward, Maria pulled her jack in the middle of her family's apartment, her little brother cheering. In Richmond, Mrs. Okafor's daughter helped her mother disconnect, both of them crying. In Palo Alto, a software engineer making $200,000 realized he'd been subsidizing his rent with his dreams. At Cerberus headquarters, alarms screamed. Processing power dropped by 47% in 30 seconds. Their carefully calibrated exploitation machine stuttered, coughed, began to fail. Webb watched his screens go dark, neighborhood by neighborhood, as thousands of minds slipped free. "Sir, we're getting cascade failures in the processing grid." "I can see that," Webb snapped. But what he couldn't see, what none of them had calculated, was what happened when you pushed people past their breaking point, when the recursive function of exploitation finally hit its base case. My phone exploded with notifications. Eviction notice from Cerberus. Breach of contract from TenantShare. Legal threats in 6 different flavors. But also, disconnected in Hayward. Free in Fremont. They can't evict us all. And from Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, we're with you. The revolution spreading at the speed of thought, finally thinking for itself. I packed my boxes, headed for the door. In the hallway, Mrs. Okafor was doing the same, her daughter helping with the heavy stuff. "Where will you go?" I asked. "My cousin in Sacramento." "You? Not sure yet?" She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. "That's okay. We'll figure it out. With our own minds, this time." Outside, the street was chaos. Moving trucks, police cars, news vans. Hundreds of people with boxes and bags, neural jacks dark, minds free. Cerberus had called in private security, but they were outnumbered. You can't evict a movement. "Professor Chen." Maria ran up, backpack bouncing. "Did you see the news?" The city council called an emergency session. They're talking about regulating neural sharing. It was a start. Not a solution, not yet, but a crack in the system. And cracks, as any engineer knows, have a way of spreading. I found Patricia in the crowd, distributing water bottles and phone numbers for tenant lawyers. "What now?" I asked. "Now we organize the camps, make sure everyone has somewhere to sleep tonight. Tomorrow, we start the real fight." "And if we lose?" She looked at the crowd, at the hundreds of people who'd chosen uncertainty over exploitation. "Then we lose together. But at least we'll lose as ourselves." I helped load boxes until my arms ached. Somewhere in the crowd, Deshaun was setting up a mobile hotspot, creating an impromptu network for people to coordinate. His mom was handing out sandwiches. Mrs. Okafor was teaching people how to disable the tracking in their phones. As the sun set over Oakland, painting the sky in shades of smoke and gold, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly. Hope was too clean a word for this mess. But possibility. The chance that tomorrow might be different than today. My neural jack was cool now, a dead port behind my ear. Eventually, I'd have it removed. But for now, it was a reminder, a scar, a promise that some things weren't for sale. The camps formed in parks and parking lots, under freeways and beside churches. Not ideal, but survivable. And more importantly, visible. Every tent was a middle finger to the system that had tried to mine us hollow. I kept coding through it all, building tools for the resistance, a mesh network app so camps could communicate without corporate internet, a resource-sharing platform for food, medicine, and shelter, documentation systems for police interactions and corporate retaliation. My students helped, turning our displacement into a massive hackathon for human dignity. The media attention was immediate and intense. Neural refugees, they called us, missing the point entirely. We weren't refugees, we were strikers. Workers withholding the only labour that couldn't be automated. Our consciousness itself. Cerberus tried everything. Legal injunctions, private security. They even offered amnesty. Return now, reduced neural sharing. No penalties. A few people took it. Most didn't. We'd tasted cognitive freedom and wouldn't go back. Within a week, the state stepped in, not with solutions, but with proposals. Emergency Assembly Bill 2847, the Neural Rights Act. Regulations on neural sharing that included maximum 4 hours unconscious processing per 24-hour period. Zero conscious processing without explicit, revocable daily consent. Mandatory 8-hour cooling-off periods between sessions. Real-time monitoring apps with kill switches tenants controlled. Transparent accounting of how neural resources were used. Criminal penalties for exceeding agreed-upon limits. Right to cognitive damages for unauthorized access. The first victory was small but symbolic. Removal of neural jacks would be covered under state insurance, and no lease could require maintaining neural capability. Within days, clinics were booked solid. The removal surgery took 2 hours, left a small scar, and most people reported immediate relief despite minor motor issues that faded within weeks. But the bigger victory was the precedent. Other states started drafting similar bills. Seattle's ban was renewed and strengthened. The EU threatened to block American neural sharing companies entirely. The economics of exploitation were shifting. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. But it was a beginning. More importantly, it was proof that collective action worked. That code plus community could challenge capital. The camps evolved into something more permanent. Co-op housing projects, mutual aid networks, community land trusts that explicitly banned neural sharing requirements. We used the organizing infrastructure we'd built for resistance to create alternatives. I helped code management systems that were transparent, democratic, and immune to the kind of hidden clauses that had trapped us. I found a couch to crash on in West Oakland with an old colleague who'd managed to buy before the boom. Started teaching online, free classes for anyone who wanted to learn. Code for the people who'd been coded out of their own minds. The neural sharing companies tried to adapt. New contracts, better terms, promises of ethical processing. But the damage was done. Once you know what it feels like to have someone else thinking with your thoughts, you can't unknow it. Some people went back. Had to. The rent was still due, and principals don't pay for insulin or baby formula. But they went back different. Organized. Protected by unions and lawyers and the hard-won knowledge that the system needed them more than they needed it. I kept teaching. In person when I could find space, online when I couldn't. Teaching not just code, but consciousness. How to recognize the signs of neural theft. How to document, organize, resist. My students started building their own apps. Not for monetizing minds, but for protecting them. Open source neural firewalls. Collective bargaining platforms. Tools for the cognitive working class. The fight wasn't won. These battles never are, not cleanly. But something had shifted in the city's frequency. The background hum of exploitation disrupted by voices saying no. Not to progress, not to technology, but to the assumption that everything human was for sale. 6 months later, I was teaching in a borrowed classroom in a West Oakland community centre. Same cracked floors, same broken air conditioning, but no neural jacks in sight. We'd pooled resources, gotten grants, found a way to exist outside the machine. The Oakland Digital Cooperative, we called it. Part school, part hackspace, part mutual aid network. My parents had moved back from Stockton into a cooperative housing project we'd helped code the management system for. Mom ran the community kitchen. Dad taught basic computer skills to seniors. They were proud of their son, the teacher again, proud of what we'd built from the ashes of extraction. MindLog had evolved into a suite of tools for documenting all forms of wage theft and exploitation. We'd open-sourced everything, watched it spread to Amazon warehouses, gig economy drivers, even white-collar workers discovering their unpaid overtime. Turns out neural sharing was just the most literal form of a very old theft. Today, we're going to talk about recursive functions, I said, picking up a marker that didn't shake. Can anyone tell me what recursion means? Hands went up. Not many, but enough. Enough to build on. It's when a function calls itself, said a new student, young enough to have grown up with neural sharing as a fact of life. But it needs a base case, or it'll loop forever. Good, I said, turning to the whiteboard. Let's talk about base cases. Let's talk about knowing when to stop. Outside, Oakland churned on. New towers rising, old communities resisting. The rent was still due. It always would be. But now we knew the real price, and some things weren't currency. Consciousness, memory, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. They were the base case. The point where the recursion stops. The irreducible human element that says, this far, no further. I wrote the first line of code, my own thoughts, my own hand, my own mind. It was enough. It had to be.